Bobby, and good morning to everyone. Happy Good Friday to you. Last night, there were four of us in our household. We gathered together and did a Seder supper, reminding us of the significance of the season and Holy Week. And it was very mean. If you have never done a Seder supper, you might try one sometime. I think you'll be edified by it. Every spring that I can remember, there has been this eager anticipation for the arrival of opening day, the beginning of a new season, the beginning of a time where there are hopes and dreams of your team winning a pennant or maybe winning the championship, by going to the World Series. But growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, there was really not a whole lot of chance of that because I was rooting for the Cleveland Indians. In those days, they were not at the top, but always at the bottom. And so there wasn't much hope of winning World Series, but we still enjoyed the season. I always look forward to it, hoping for a better season year after year after year. But now as the seasons approach, it really conjures up memories in my mind of baseball and my love for baseball. And I always remember Roger Kahn's classic book, The Boys of Summer. Have anybody of you read that book, The Boys of Summer? Just a terrific classic about baseball. And one of the best lines out of it says that you may glory in the team triumphant, but you fall in love with the team in defeat. Losing after great striving is the story of man, and was born to sorrow, whose sweetest songs tell of the saddest thought, and who, if he is a hero, does nothing in life as becoming as leaving it. What a great classic story that is about striving and about becoming heroes and about men of integrity just trying to win a championship. It's a great piece of literature about baseball. But for me, baseball has always been something that I could trust. It's always been something there in my life. And there seems to be this inherent integrity in baseball that always gives me and has given me the sense of peace. But recently, the trust that I've had in the game that I love has begun to wane. Enter the Houston Astros. Sign stealing, lying, cheating, from the managers to the coaches to multi-million-dollar players, they've all sacrificed their integrity on and the integrity of baseball, I think, on the altar of winning. They're doing whatever it takes to win. And it really has, in my mind, changed the game. And so for me, I've lost some of my trust in Major League Baseball. And I'm sure that it is never going to be the same for me. Someone once said that winning is nice if you don't lose your integrity in the process. And I think that's very, very true. But history is replete with men who have sacrificed their integrity to win, sacrificed their integrity to get ahead in life, sacrificed their integrity to make more money. But there are men in history who have lived lives of tremendous integrity. And Daniel is one of those men. I think we're all familiar with Daniel. If you know anything of the Bible, you heard about Daniel. If I was to say to you, Daniel you would probably say, in the lion's den. That's right. You'd be correct. Daniel in the lion's den. So while Daniel's supernatural rescue from the lion is an amazing story, I think how he got into that lion's den is also an amazing story. And so that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. So if you join me in Daniel 1:1, of course, that's where the story starts, chapter 1 and verse 1. We're going to walk through the saga of how Daniel got into the lion's den and one of his characteristics that got him there. So Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, hard for me to say, Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hands of the king of Babylon. So the king of Babylon came, conquered, and the king did what kings do. They began to pillage Judah, and they took whatever they wanted. And one of the things that he took were some of the young men from Judah, some of the best and brightest young men. And he took them back to his nation. He educated them and in the king's court, and he taught them the ways of his country. And then these young men began to serve him in his court, in his government. And one of those men who did that was this young man named Daniel. So Daniel began to serve, and Daniel began to distinguish himself. So we pick up the story, men, in chapter 2 and verse 48, chapter 2 and verse 48. And this is what it says. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon. So Daniel is in the government. He's distinguishing himself. The king likes what he's doing, and he's putting more and more and more trust and confidence in him. Fascinating that he's putting so much trust in a Jewish young man, not one of his local guys, not one of his good old boys, so to speak, but he's putting this confidence in Daniel. So Daniel serves and serves and serves where God has put him. And there's no record of Daniel ever trying to undercut the government, undercut the king where he is. He serves in a place that God has put him. So let's fast forward in time. At this point, Daniel has been serving in Babylon for 70 years. He's 85 years old. And there's a new king. His name is Darius. So let's fast forward in the story to chapter 6 and verse 1 through 3. And this is what is happening at this point in time. Daniel's serving. He's serving under this new king Darius. And Darius hears about Daniel, hears he's a great leader, hears that he's faithful, hears that he's loyal, hears that he's a man of integrity. And so this is what happens, chapter 6, 1 through 3. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Apparently, the king was suspicious of some of his people. They might have been skimming off the top, putting some in their pocket, and the king was not trusting them, and he wanted someone that he could trust. So Daniel began to distinguish himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. So Daniel now is about ready to be second in command under the king. So I wonder, what were the qualities that Darius saw in Daniel that caused him to put such great confidence in him and give him such authority? Was it that he was trustworthy? He even said it here that he had an extraordinary spirit. There was something in Daniel that Darius saw that caused Daniel to rise above the other men. And I think this thing that Darius was seeing in Daniel was a man of extraordinary integrity, a man who had a level of integrity above anyone that Darius had ever seen. So now Daniel was a man who followed well, and he also was a man who led well, and he did both with integrity. James Kouzes and Barry Posner's series on credibility, they report surveying thousands of people around the world and performing more than 400 written case studies to find the characteristics most desired in a leader. In virtually every single one of the surveys, honesty and integrity were identified more frequently than any other trait. In other words, people looked for honesty in men. People looked for integrity in men. They were the things that they wanted to see most in men who they followed, men who led, and men who they trusted. And so Daniel was that kind of a man. And he's teaching us, showing us that this is a pattern that we should follow. We also should be that kind of a man. So Daniel is about to be second in control, second in command. And as you can imagine, there was no peace in the kingdom. There was no peace in the government. The idea of an outsider, a Jewish guy ruling over them was more than it could take. They did not like that at all. And so they did something that we're seeing in our world today. They're seeing what we're seeing as politics in Washington, D.C., kind of being similar to what was going on there in Babylon. They pushed back. They didn't like what was going on, so they attacked. They launched a full-scale inquiry into Daniel's life. I'm telling you, they must have gone back 70 years and turned over everything that Daniel had done, trying to find something that they could charge him with. And so we pick up the story in chapter 6 and verse 5, and this is what they were doing. Then these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel. See, they couldn't find a single thing to charge him with. So they said, unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. In other words, this man is squeaky clean. The king loves him. So we're going to have to find another way to trip him up. And the only way we're going to trip up this guy Daniel is by playing on his own integrity. Actually, it was a brilliant idea. But I think they had a very good idea of how Daniel was going to react when pushed about his beliefs and pushed hard against what his practices were. And so that's exactly what they did. They pushed Daniel at a point where they know he would not compromise. In verse 6, this is what happened. Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows: King Darius, live forever. Let's live forever. Let's set up the king. All of the commissioners of the kingdom. So they're telling Darius that all the commissioners of the kingdom have come together and agree on this. And that's not true, was it? Daniel was a commissioner and he was not part of this strategy, but they're tricking the king into believing that he was. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Well, man, that is exactly how Daniel ended up in the lion's den. His integrity, his refusal to compromise on his beliefs did cost him in this case. It did put him in the lion's den. You know, we all know he had prayed for 3 times a year, 3 times a day for 70 years. He did it with his windows open. Everybody could see what he was doing. They knew he was a righteous man. But God, and so God prayed that, or Daniel prayed that way to God, and he did not compromise. There was no intention in Daniel's life of changing the behaviors that he had had. He was always a man of prayer, and he was going to be a man of prayer, and no one was going to change Daniel's pattern. They weren't going to attack his integrity to make him change. But I think it's interesting, you know, Daniel, he could have rescheduled his prayer times. Daniel could have closed his windows. He could have prayed silently to himself. Or maybe he could have just not prayed at all for those 30 days. But he knew that anything different in his life, doing anything differently in a time of crisis would compromise his integrity, and he couldn't and wouldn't live with that. I'm just wondering if C.S. Lewis might have been writing about men like Daniel when he said, integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. That's the kind of man Daniel was. His whole career, he did the right thing regardless of who was watching. And in this situation, he did the right thing regardless of who was watching. He did not compromise his integrity. Well, I think we all know how the story ends, right? Daniel continued to pray as he always had. Daniel was thrown in the lion's den, but Daniel was saved from the lion by his God because of his integrity, because of his belief, and it had a tremendous impact on Darius the king. So let's switch gears for a minute. Let me ask you this question. What is the opposite of integrity? The opposite of integrity is hypocrisy. A man can have integrity, or a man can be a hypocrite. They are opposite ends of the spectrum. So hypocrisy, as we know, is saying something and acting differently. And so we're going to look at an example here of how Jesus responded to men who were hypocrites. So turn over in your Bible with me this morning to Matthew chapter 23. We're just going to spend a little bit of time there this morning. Matthew chapter 23. And let's see what Jesus says about hypocrisy. Matthew chapter 23. Start in verse 1. Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. In other words, they've set themselves up as the highest authority. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe. But do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and they do not do them. Here are these men who were telling people to act in certain ways, to do certain things, but the leaders themselves were not doing them. So let's jump forward to verse 15 and let's see what happens here. Verse 15. Jesus says to these scribes and these Pharisees, you hypocrites, woe unto you, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Pretty strong words from Jesus, weren't they, men? Verse 27, he continues, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead man's bones and are unclean. So you, too, outward appear righteous to men, but inward you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Reminds me of what C.S. Lewis said. Integrity is doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. These men were not doing the right thing. They were speaking one thing, telling people one thing, and yet they were doing another. Skip over to verse 33 and let's see the final thing that Jesus says to these guys. These are very strong words about men who are hypocrites. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? There's a price to pay for hypocrisy. Jesus makes that very clear when he's talking to these people. Men, Christ wants us to be disciplined men. He wants us to be disciplined leaders who behave consistently between what is inside and what is outside, what is inside of us and what is observed by others. So, man, I think we are in a time unlike any other time that I've certainly ever experienced, and I think probably you will agree with me on that. The expectations that are put upon us right now, because what is going on in our world, our society, our lives, our businesses is weighty. The demands on our time are onerous. The things that we have to do, the decisions we are making about business, about employees, about expenses, about our family, they're unlike anything that we've experienced in a long time, maybe ever. And many of us are fielding calls from clients, we're fielding calls from customers who are really unsettled by what is going on. And I think these are days when men could be tempted to change their behavior. They might be tempted to act in different ways than they might have in past times. A man could be tempted now to cut corners. He could be tempted to tell half-truths. He could be tempted to hide the facts. He could be tempted to hoard his wealth when there are other people that need his assistance. There are a lot of temptations that push against our integrity right now because of what is going on in our world. It would be easy, man, I think, to sacrifice our integrity on the altar of convenience, on the altar of selfishness. And I encourage you not to do that. I think Dr. James Merritt said it well in his book on character. This is what he said. You got to make up your mind that your integrity is more important than your safety, than your security, than your prosperity, than your position or your popularity. And Dr. Merritt is right. We have to make up our minds to be a certain kind of man. There are men, I think, who seem to get away with things that they ought not get away with. Some of the boys of summer sacrificed their integrity to win a championship, and their integrity will never return to them. It is gone forever. So what kind of men are we to be? How should this impact our lives? I think, men, we are to be the kind of leaders that Daniel taught us to be. Men who are committed to maintaining our integrity regardless of the cost, regardless of the temptation, regardless of what is going on in society. We are to be men who are to set a leadership standard on integrity for other men to follow. So our challenge today is we are living in a time that is uniquely different. We need to rise to the occasion, live to a higher standard, and be a man like Daniel. Pray with me, will you? Father, we just thank you for your truth. We thank you for the example of Daniel. And we thank you for the challenge that Jesus Christ himself gave to us not to be hypocritical in our lives. Strengthen us, Father, to be the kind of men that you want us to be in these unusual times. We trust you and we thank you. We pray this in your son's name. Amen. Thank you for joining us, guys. Have a great time at your virtual tables.